Maybe the best way to begin this morning is in silence. Take just a few seconds to take in silence. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is recorded as saying, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines and earthquakes in various places, but all of this must take place as the beginnings of the birth pains." Jesus spoke those words in a precarious time, and he did so in the city of Jerusalem. Now, it's important to remember how important Jerusalem is. Imagine for a moment that we would take New York City and Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles and wrap them all up into one. That's what Jerusalem meant to the Jews. Cannot overstate the significance of that city. And inasmuch as Jerusalem is a Jewish city, it is under Roman rule. The Romans are everywhere. And in just a few years after Jesus says these words, Roman soldiers will come into the temple, the holiest place for the Jew, and rob the temple of its riches, and tear down walls. And any Jew who gets in the way will be killed on the spot. It was a violent time. But it's always been a violent time, hasn't it? I mean, just how did the Romans get control of Jerusalem and Judea and Assyria and Egypt and the whole Middle East? Through violence, or at least through the threat of violence. Take a look at that map. See how the Roman powers spread north and west and south and east. How did they do that? They didn't make themselves popular by warming and charming their enemies. No, they killed and hacked and plundered and slaughtered their way through the Middle East. The world has always had that level of violence. Take a look at this graph. It's difficult to see. Somebody took the time to chronicle all the major conflicts in the world since 1400. Each rose-colored circle represents a conflict, and the size of the circle would tell you how many people died in those wars. And so you see the large circles on the upper right representing the First and the Second World War. But there are hundreds of smaller circles, 3,708 of them to be precise. And did you notice how much more the circles gain in intensity from the year 1800 to the current date? It's like the world has chicken pox.
Yeah.
There are wars and rumors of wars and revolutions and rebellions and genocides happening all the time. And they're happening right now as well. Another graph showing the major hotspots in the world. And so whether we're talking about civil war in Syria, or street riots in Hong Kong, or conflict in Ukraine, or criminal violence in Mexico, or Boko Haram in Nigeria, or nuclear threat in Iran, or street violence in Myanmar, or political unrest in dozens of countries around the globe, every day we are reminded on the news, on social media that ours is a troubled world. We're 70.8 million people. That's more people than exist in California, Oregon, and Washington combined. 70.8 million people are displaced because of conflict. And so, quite frankly, when Jesus says that nation will rise up against nation, he wasn't kidding. And I'm left to wonder if Jesus at that moment was able to see into the future and to notice how much hatred would exist, how much conflict there would be between people and nations, and all of the ingenious ways that people would come up with in order to kill other people. The next few weeks we are going to be reflecting upon things like war and conflict and discord and division. And we're going to try and understand how it is that we, people of faith, Christians who follow the Prince of Peace, are supposed to act and react in this troubled world. Today we're looking at this theme from a wide-angle view. And each week we're going to narrow the scope from world to nation to churches to individuals. And I'm hoping that we will come away from this reflection with a greater understanding of what does it mean for us to follow and to believe in the Prince of Peace. And so, in this wide-angle sense, for the most part, when it comes to places like North Korea or Syria or Afghanistan and other locations in the world where there is global conflict, we watch that from a distance. Maybe some of you, because of military service or because of world travel in one way or another, have experienced firsthand what this looks like, what death and destruction on a large scale is all about. But most of us haven't. I haven't. And even for those who have, it's not like we wake up every day wondering, well, is this the day that my life ends because of war? But millions of people do. So how do we, as believing people in God, do so and yet know how deadly the world is? How are we supposed to think about this troubled world? I know of some Christians who will say things like, war is okay. As a matter of fact, it's encouraged. They point to places in the Old Testament where the Israelites were commanded by God to go into other countries and to destroy life. And they say, see, it's okay for people to encourage war. It seems to be God's plan for humanity. Well, this today isn't the time or the place to address the holy wars spoken about in the Old Testament, particularly in Joshua and Judges. I believe those stories need to be read very, very carefully, because they're not stories that one should easily pass over, believing that this is God's desire for humanity. Instead, I would turn to the New Testament, and particularly turn to the words of Jesus, just as those that we heard read a few moments ago from the 14th chapter of St. John. Jesus is talking to his disciples before he gets arrested and crucified. He knows what's going to happen. They don't know what's going to happen. He knows that he will be a victim of violence. And he says to them, receive my peace. The world gives you peace. I give you peace. It's not the same thing. What is the way of peace in the world? How do governments secure peace? One of the most peaceful times the world has ever known was that 200-year period from just before the birth of Jesus to about the year 180. It was called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. And what made it so peaceful is that Rome had defeated all of its enemies. and that they had a military strong enough to keep everybody in their place and in line. And if you got out of line, well, then they had the cross to teach you a lesson. And governments have sought peace through strength ever since. I mean, you don't want to pick a fight with somebody who has a club. And if you have a club, you don't want to pick a fight with somebody who has a gun. And if you have a gun, you don't want to pick a fight with somebody who has an army. And it escalates on until you have countries who have nuclear warheads. Do you see how the arms race was born? But Jesus says, as he leaves his disciples, that he offers a different kind of peace. And he proceeds to tell them, don't let your hearts be troubled. Don't let them be afraid. And you might think to yourself, now wait a second, how did we get from world conflict to worrying about peace in our hearts? I mean, the world has people dying. Shouldn't I be concerned about that? But Jesus turns it inward, and he seems to be addressing what's inside of me. But you know, that's just what Jesus does. He internalizes life's most distressing problems. Jesus may start out there, but then he brings it in here. A world is troubled because hearts are troubled. Nations are at war because people's souls are at war with themselves. I mean, in a macro sense, it isn't hard to see how some of the world's most notorious warmongers, Adolf Hitler, Pol, Joseph Stalin, Pontius Pilate, understanding how depraved and abused their souls had been, and because they were people possessed with great power and they had empty souls, it makes perfect sense why nations go against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms. And so therefore, while I care very little which party occupies the White House, I care deeply about the person who sits at the desk in the White House, praying that that person's soul is at peace. I invite you to join me in that prayer as well. What is the condition of your soul? Do you find peace residing there? If not, then wars and rumors of wars are only too well known by you. And you might just be resigned to living in that kind of world. But there is an alternative, right? If you are a person of peace, the kind given by Jesus, then that alters the way that you look at conflict. And you begin to understand that Jesus teaches that we never objectify others, even to the point where he drives home this notion, asking us to pray for our enemies. When was the last time you prayed for Al-Qaeda? Or Al-Shabaab? Or Mexican drug lords? Or the New York Yankees? You see, according to Jesus, that's what people whose souls are at peace do. And they do it not because it's defeating, not because they're weak, but because somehow they believe that their prayers can bring peace. Lest we forget, Jesus reminds us that the ruler of this world, the one who loves to see people kill people, the one who encourages decimation and destruction, he has no power over Jesus. Which says to me, simple acts of goodness and kindness, simple efforts such as praying for enemies, has power for good. Yesterday, we attempted to put up 1,000 cranes. We didn't quite get there. We have more work to do coming up. Why would we do that? Many of you know the horrific account of the dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A little girl, 2 years old, whose name was Sadako Sasuke, lived in Hiroshima when the bomb went off. She was exposed to radiation. She developed leukemia. At the age of 12, after spending an inordinate period of time in the hospital, she began to fold origami cranes, paper cranes, wanting to fold 1,000 of those. She eventually folded 644 before she became too weak and eventually passed away. Her school mates, in her honor, completed the folding of the rest of the 356. The crane has become a symbol of peace since the days of Sadako. The folding of these cranes, especially 1,000 of them, is a symbol of one's desire for world peace. In fact, there's a statue of Sadako with a crane in Hiroshima Peace Park, not far from Ground Zero, where the bomb went off. This past summer, some of us from Christ Lutheran Church visited the Cathedral Church of St. Michael in Coventry, England. I've mentioned this in the past. The church was an early bombing target in 1940 by the Luftwaffe. And although the structure of the church was completely decimated, they decided to keep it as an ongoing testimony to the resiliency of the people of faith, even in the face of war. The church that was built to replace it next door is a church that is dedicated to reconciliation and world peace. And from the rafters of one of the side chapels hangs 1,000 cranes.
Wow.
Every Sunday evening in that church, a German-speaking Lutheran church worships there. So, as in Hiroshima or Coventry, maybe our cranes are just an example of how something might take root in the heart and spill over to have an impact on world peace. We have no idea. The prophet Isaiah said, "Like a swallow or a crane, I clamor. I moan like a dove. My eyes are weary with looking upward. O Lord, I am oppressed. Be my security." May we continue to look to the Lord, the Prince of Peace for our life, the one who is stronger than the powers of war and death, the one who calms the raging storms in our souls. May Jesus bring us peace. And through us, in simple acts of prayer and folding cranes, proclaim his lordship, so that someday we will learn of war no more. Amen. The peace of the Lord be with you always. I invite you to rise and share the important gift of peace to those who are near you.